The heavy vibration of a secondary device against a granite countertop has a specific frequency that cuts through even the strongest Chicago wind. I knew exactly what it was the moment I felt the mechanical hum against my palm while I was organizing the pantry of our West Loop apartment. It was a Saturday morning, and my ritual was simple and predictable. I was moving glass jars of imported grains to the back shelf when I discovered the phone tucked behind a decorative box of matches we never used. Only one person could have hidden it there with such deliberate concealment. Jensen had always operated under the assumption that his silence was the same thing as safety. I did not reach for the device with a trembling hand, and I did not feel my pulse quicken in my throat. I simply set my coffee mug down and watched the light from the small screen bleed into the dark stone of the counter. That was the moment I realized who I was really dealing with. The device was an older model, but it was active and the battery was nearly full. When I finally picked it up, the screen glowed with a notification from an encrypted messaging app I had never seen on his primary phone. The contact was not saved under a name, but under the label wife, followed by a heart emoji. The background of the chat was a deep romantic red. I began to scroll through the history, and the realization settled over me with the clinical weight of a court transcript. They were talking about a future. They were talking about a life that sounded remarkably similar to the one he had been describing to me over dinner for the last 3 years. Jensen was 34 years old, a man who built his career on being a consultant for high-stakes firms, but his personal life was built on a series of amateurish shadows. He had been calling her every day and texting her every night, and meeting her in the gaps of time he claimed were swallowed by his firm in the loop. I did not delete the messages, and I did not scream into the empty apartment. My name is Sloan, and as a 32-year-old project manager, I have spent my career identifying structural flaws before they cause a collapse. This was just another failure in the foundation. I took my own phone and began a systematic recording of every screen and every date and every photo they had exchanged over the last 18 months. The images were dated back to before we had even signed the lease on this high-rise. He had been maintaining this parallel reality since the very beginning of our relationship. I found logs of financial transfers and restaurant reservations in neighborhoods like the Gold Coast and Lincoln Park, where he told me he hated the traffic. The evidence was concrete and indisputable. There was no room for interpretation and no space for an accidental misunderstanding. Jensen was not just a liar, he was a technician of deception. I looked at the photos of them together, and I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I felt the clarity of a person who had finally seen the blueprint of a faulty structure. I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing at 5 p.m. The sound of his expensive leather boots echoed on the hardwood floor of the entryway. I stayed in the kitchen and kept my back to him. I felt the shift in the air as he entered the room. He smelled like the cold city air and the expensive cologne I had bought him for our last anniversary. He greeted me with the same rehearsed warmth he used every evening. He asked how my day was, and he moved to the fridge to grab a bottle of water. I watched him in the reflection of the dark oven door. Jensen looked exactly like the man I thought I loved. There was no outward sign of the rot underneath. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed his secrets were ironclad, and that his partner was too focused on her spreadsheets to notice the gaps in his story. I turned around and placed the secondary phone on the granite counter between us. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him. The transformation was instantaneous. The casual confidence in his posture vanished and was replaced by a rigid mask of panic that he tried to hide behind a confused smile. He did not apologize, and he did not break down in tears. His first instinct was to reach for the device, but I moved my hand faster. I told him that I had already seen everything and that the contents were backed up in a location he would never find. He stood there frozen for a moment before the first layer of his defense began to form. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. He told me that it was not what it looked like. He said that nothing physical had ever happened and that they were just talking because he was going through a hard time at work. He claimed that the wife label was an inside joke between old friends from college and that I was overreacting to a harmless fantasy. When I reminded him that I had seen the dates and the physical locations of their meetings at hotels downtown, he shifted his strategy. He said he had deleted the messages before showing me his phone in the past because he wanted to protect my feelings from unnecessary doubt. He told me that he hid the truth because he did not want to hurt me. He actually expected me to appreciate his discretion, as if his lying was a form of emotional labor. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured sincerity, as if he were the one making a sacrifice for our relationship. I stood there and watched him spin a web of contradictions. He admitted to the meetings, but denied the intimacy. He admitted to the lies, but called them an act of love. He was like a child caught in a corner, trying to redefine the meaning of the word truth to suit his current needs. He told me that he had blocked her the moment he realized I was upset, but I knew he was lying. I had seen the active status on the screen only minutes before he walked through the door. He was still trying to manage me. He was still trying to control the narrative, even when the foundation had already crumbled. I realized then that this was not a man who was capable of accountability. He was a man who lived in the margins of reality, where consequences were things that happened to other people. He looked at me with a performative shock, as if my lack of an emotional outburst was the real betrayal. He asked why I was being so cold, and he told me that my calm demeanor made him feel unsafe in his own home. He was attempting to weaponize my composure against me. He wanted a fight so he could play the victim, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a single tear. I told him that the relationship was over and that he had 24 hours to gather his things. The next few hours were a display of theatrical desperation that I will never forget. Jensen began to pace the length of the living room, and he talked about destiny and karma. He said that I was giving up too easily and that our love was worth more than a few mistakes in judgment. When he saw that his words were having no effect, he moved to a more physical performance. He claimed he was having trouble breathing, and he sat on the sofa clutching his chest and gasping for air. He was pretending to suffocate because he could not handle the weight of his own actions being brought into the light. I watched him with the detachment of an observer behind a glass partition. I knew his medical history, and I knew he was perfectly healthy. This was just another layer of manipulation. It was a tactic designed to force me into a caretaking role. If I staged to help him breathe, I could not leave him for cheating. It was a transparent attempt to regain control through pity. I told him that if he was truly having a medical emergency, I would call an ambulance, but I would not be the one to hold his hand. The moment I mentioned the paramedics, his breathing returned to normal, and his face hardened into a mask of resentment. He spent the rest of the night texting his mother. Mrs. Garrick was a woman who believed her son was a saint, and that any woman in his life was a temporary obstacle to his greatness. I could hear his muffled voice on the phone in the guest room. He was telling her a version of the story where I was the aggressor. He was telling her that I had invaded his privacy and that I was kicking him out over a misunderstanding about a work contact. I knew she was feeding his delusion. I knew that by morning I would be the villain in their family group chat. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the office and began to look deeper into the financial records I had pulled from the hidden phone. Jensen had been using the joint account we set up for the apartment to fund his outings with the other woman. He had been charging dinners and hotel stays to a card that I partially paid for every month from my own salary. He had also been using my professional network to secure leads for his consulting business. He had built his professional reputation on the back of my hard work and my connections in the Chicago business community. He was not just cheating on me, he was parasitic. The architecture of his betrayal was more extensive than I had originally imagined. He had convinced me to put the lease in my name because his credit was bruised from a previous business failure that I now realize was likely another lie. He had convinced me to cover the majority of the security deposit. He had positioned himself so that he had all the benefits of our life together with none of the risks. He thought he was the one in control because he was the one with the secrets. He thought that because I was a person who valued stability and logic, I would be too afraid of the chaos of a breakup to actually follow through with an eviction. He was wrong. He had confused my patience for weakness. He had assumed that because I did not scream, I did not have teeth. As the sun began to rise over the skyline, I realized that simply ending the relationship was not enough. To Jensen, a breakup was just a temporary setback. He would find another woman to support him and another apartment to hide his secrets in. He would continue to use people until there was nothing left of their reputations or their bank accounts. I needed to ensure that there were institutional and social consequences that he could not gaslight his way out of. I spent the morning hours compiling a dossier that would serve as the foundation for my next move. I had the bank statements and the text logs and the photographs. I had the records of the clients he had poached and the lies he had told them about his role in my firm. I had evidence of the way he had misrepresented his income to the landlord. Every document was a brick in a wall that was closing in around him. I was not acting out of anger. I was acting out of a necessity for balance. He had broken the social contract, and now he would have to deal with the fine print. When Jensen emerged from the guest room, he looked tired, but he still had that glimmer of arrogance in his eyes. He thought that after a night of reflection, I would be ready to talk about reconciliation. He came into the kitchen and made a comment about how we both needed to move past this for the sake of our future. He spoke as if the decision to stay together had already been made by his sheer presence. He actually asked me to appreciate his honesty about the hidden phone, even though I was the one who had to find it for the truth to come out. He said he felt like a weight had been lifted now that we were being open with each other. I did not respond to his overtures. I told him again that his time in this apartment was running out. I watched him realize that his usual charms were failing to penetrate my resolve. The mask slipped again, and this time it stayed off. He began to threaten me. He said that if I left him, he would kill himself. He said that I would never find anyone who loved me the way he did. He told me that I was cold and heartless and that I would die alone in this expensive apartment because no one else would put up with my rigidity. He was throwing every emotional weapon he had at me, hoping one of them would leave a mark. None of them did. I knew that the next phase of his plan would involve my family and my friends. Jensen was a master of the preemptive strike. He would call them and tell them I was having a mental breakdown. I had already anticipated this move. I had already drafted a message to my inner circle, but I had not sent it yet. I was waiting for the right moment to release the information. I was waiting for him to make the first move so that his eventual exposure would be more devastating to his reputation. By noon, he had packed one suitcase. He stood by the door and looked at me with a mixture of hatred and expectation. He told me that he was leaving for a few days to give me space, but that he expected me to call him within the week. He said that boundaries expire after 7 days and that he would be waiting for my apology for violating his privacy. He actually believed that he was the one granting me a period of reflection. He walked out of the apartment and slammed the door with a force that rattled the frames on the walls. I did not move for a long time. I sat in the silence of the high-rise and looked at the city below. The streets were busy with people who had no idea that a 3-year lie had just collapsed in a living room above them. Jensen was out there now thinking he had escaped the worst of the fallout. He thought the loss of the apartment and the relationship was the final price he would have to pay. He had no idea that I was just getting started. I had the leverage, and I had the proof, and I had the patience to wait for the system to do its work. The first wave of the consequences was ready. I just had to wait for him to think he was safe. The silence of the West Loop apartment after the door slammed was not a vacuum. It was a space that I finally owned. Jensen had walked out with one suitcase and a sense of unearned confidence that the world would bend back to his will within the week. He believed in the expiration of boundaries because he had spent 34 years never facing a consequence that he could not charm his way out of. But charm is a social currency, and I was moving the conflict into a territory where only institutional facts mattered. I spent the first hour after his departure at my desk, and the glow of the monitor was the only light in the room. I was not looking for closure, and I was not looking for peace. I was looking for the exact points of pressure that would ensure his exit was permanent and his recovery was impossible. I began with the joint bank account. We had established it for household expenses, but as I scrutinized the digital ledger, I saw the pattern of a parasite. Jensen had been skimming small amounts for months and transferring them to a secondary account I had never been permitted to see. He had used our shared funds to pay for the deposits on the hotels where he met the woman he called his wife. He had even used it to buy the jewelry that appeared in the photos I had found on the hidden device. I did not call the bank to complain. I called to report unauthorized activity. Since the lease and the primary utility accounts were in my name, I had the standing to freeze the assets. I moved every cent of my own earnings into a private vault and left the joint account with a balance of exactly $0. The financial trail led me to his professional life. Jensen worked as a senior consultant, but his success was a carefully constructed mirage. He had spent the last 2 years using my name and my position as a project manager to gain access to architectural firms and developers that would never have taken his calls otherwise. I found emails on the hidden phone where he had misrepresented our relationship as a professional partnership. He had promised clients access to my proprietary data and my internal network in exchange for consulting retainers. He was selling my labor behind my back. I spent the middle of the night drafting a formal notification to the ethics board of his firm and the legal departments of the clients he had poached. I attached the screenshots of his emails and the timestamps that proved he was conducting this side business on their time using my resources. By 3 a.m, the dossier was a digital weapon. I reached out to the woman in the hidden phone. Her name was Nallery, and she lived in a suburb 40 minutes north of the city. I did not approach her with a message of sisterhood or a plea for a shared emotional healing. I sent her a link to a secure folder containing the logs of Jensen's financial transfers and the lease agreement that proved he was living entirely on my income, while telling her he was a high-flying bachelor in the city. I included the dates where he told me he was at his mother's house while he was actually with her, and the dates he told her he was on business trips while he was in bed with me. I gave her the facts, and I gave her the evidence, and then I closed the window. I did not need her response to know that the fire was lit. The sun rose over the Chicago skyline with a cold and indifferent light. At 8 a.m, the first wave of the institutional response began. My phone remained silent because I had already blocked Jensen on every personal channel, but the notifications on my professional email started to chime. His firm had received the ethics complaint. The legal departments of 2 major developers were asking for clarification on the data he had promised them. Jensen's world was a house of cards, and the wind was finally starting to blow. I went to the building management office and showed them the evidence of his misrepresented income on the original application. Because the lease was in my name, and he had technically committed fraud to be listed as a co-occupant, I had the legal right to have the locks changed immediately. I watched the locksmith work with a sense of clinical satisfaction. The clicking of the new tumblers was the sound of a closing chapter. I had the old locks placed in a bag and set them on the small table in the entryway. Jensen's mother, Mrs. Garrick, called me around noon. I did not ignore the call. I answered it, and I put it on speaker so I could record the conversation. She did not lead with a greeting. She led with a demand. She told me that I was being hysterical and that Jensen was a good man who had made a small mistake because of the pressure I put on him. She said that her family would not stand for this kind of public embarrassment, and that if I did not take him back, she would make sure my reputation in the city was ruined. She talked about her social circle and her influence in the charitable organizations where I volunteered.
I did not interrupt her. I let her speak until she ran out of breath, and then I played back the recording of Jensen admitting to the financial fraud and the second phone. I told her that I was currently looking at the bank statements that showed her son had also been taking money from her retirement fund to pay for his lifestyle. I had found the transfers while digging through the hidden devices cache. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The authority she thought she held evaporated in the face of a document she could not argue with. I told her that if she contacted me again, or if she attempted to interfere with my professional life, the recordings of this call and the evidence of her son's theft from her would be sent to the police and the local press. I hung up before she could find her voice.
The second wave of the escalation happened in the afternoon. Jensen tried to use his key. I heard the scratching of metal against the new lock from the other side of the door. I did not move from my chair in the living room. I watched the handle jiggle, and then the frantic pounding began. He was shouting my name and demanding to know what I had done. He told me that this was his home and that I had no right to lock him out. I remained silent. I had already called the building security and the police non-emergency line to report a domestic disturbance by a non-resident. I watched the security feed on my phone as two guards approached him in the hallway. They informed him that his name had been removed from the access list due to the fraudulent application and that he was now trespassing. Jensen's reaction was exactly what I had predicted. He did not go quietly. He tried to charm the guards, and then he tried to intimidate them. He claimed he had a medical condition and that his medication was inside. He was repeating the performance from the night before, but the guards were not his partner, and they were not his mother. They were professionals following a protocol. When he realized that the theatrical gasping for air was not working, he transitioned back into a cold rage. He shouted that he would sue me and that he would take everything I owned. I opened the door just wide enough to slide the bag of his old locks and his remaining suitcase into the hallway. I did not look at him. I looked at the lead security officer and thanked him for his assistance. By the evening, the social fallout was irreversible. Mallory had sent me a brief message. She had confronted Jensen at his mother's house, and she had brought her brother, who happened to be a partner at a competing consulting firm. The overlap was perfect. Jensen had not just lost 2 women in 24 hours. He had lost the shroud of anonymity that allowed him to operate. His firm had placed him on administrative leave pending the investigation into the ethics violations and the misappropriated client data. The leverage I held was no longer just a private secret. It was an institutional weight that was crushing his ability to function in the city. He was 34 years old, and for the first time in his life, the system was working against him instead of for him. I sat by the window and watched the lights of the city flicker on. Jensen was likely at a cheap hotel or on his mother's sofa, realizing that the boundaries he thought had expired were actually iron gates. He had assumed that my patience was a resource he could mine forever, but he had failed to realize that project managers do not just build things. We also know exactly how to dismantle a structure that has been deemed unsafe for habitation. I had the recordings, and I had the bank records, and I had the professional testimonies. Every move he made now only served to tighten the grip of the consequences I had set in motion. He thought the first day was the peak of the conflict, but he was about to learn that in a drama of revenge, the second act is where the price truly begins to rise. The winter in Chicago has a way of stripping everything down to the bone, and the third week after Jensen left was the coldest on record. I spent those days in a state of high-functioning neutrality. I was not waiting for him to change, and I was not waiting for the anger to fade, because anger requires an investment of energy that I was currently directing toward a different kind of architecture.
Jensen had sent a formal letter through a low-rent attorney he had hired with what remained of his credit card limit. The letter accused me of illegal eviction and defamation of character. It was a predictable move for a man who believed that the law was just another narrative he could manipulate with enough confidence. He wanted a settlement, and he wanted the locks to the West Loop apartment changed back. He actually believed that this was a negotiation. I sat at my desk and reviewed the letter with the same detachment I used for a budget variance report. I did not call his attorney, and I did not engage in the back and forth of legal threats. Instead, I submitted the final phase of the audit I had been conducting since the night I found the hidden phone. I had discovered that Jensen had not just been skimming from our joint account, he had been using his access to my professional credentials to sign off on building inspections for a developer on the South Side. It was a project I had no connection to, but his signatures were a digital forgery of my own authorization. This moved the situation from a domestic dispute into the territory of criminal fraud and professional misconduct. This was the second layer of evidence that I had held back until he made his move.
The meeting with the ethics committee of his firm was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The office was located in a glass tower on Wacker Drive, where the air always felt thin and expensive. I arrived 10 minutes early and I wore a suit that communicated exactly who I was, a project manager who prioritized structural integrity above all else. Jensen was already there, sitting in the waiting area with his attorney. He looked different than he had 3 weeks ago. The expensive cologne was the same, but the skin around his eyes was tight, and his posture had lost its rehearsed arrogance. He tried to stand up when I walked in, but the look I gave him was so clinical that he sat back down without saying a word. He still thought he had a chance to spin this. He still thought this was about a relationship. When we were called into the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the silent judgment of the partners. Jensen's attorney began a prepared statement about personal vendettas and the privacy of domestic life. He talked about my actions as an emotional reaction to a breakup. I waited until he was finished, and then I opened the leather portfolio I had brought with me. I did not talk about the cheating, and I did not talk about the woman he called his wife. I placed the forged inspection reports on the table, along with the digital logs of the IP addresses used to access the system. Every single one of them traced back to Jensen's laptop during hours when he claimed to be working late at the office. The partners did not look at the attorney, they looked at Jensen. I explained the mechanics of the fraud with a voice that was flat and steady. I showed them how he had used his knowledge of my login protocols to bypass the internal security of the project management software. I presented the bank statements showing the payments from the South Side developer that were deposited into the secret account I had identified weeks ago. This was no longer about a secret phone or a romantic betrayal. This was about a 34-year-old man who had compromised the legal standing of his firm and the safety of a construction project to fund his parallel life. The silence in the room was absolute. Jensen tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and he looked at the senior partner with a desperate plea for understanding. The partner simply closed the file and looked away. The fallout was institutional and immediate. His firm did not just fire him, they initiated a full-scale internal investigation and notified the state licensing board. Jensen's attorney realized within 10 minutes that there was no defense for criminal forgery, and he advised his client to remain silent. The senior partner thanked me for my transparency and apologized for the fact that their employee had targeted me. I walked out of that office and I did not look back to see if Jensen was following. I knew he was tethered to that room by the weight of the facts I had left on the table. He was no longer a consultant, and he was no longer a player in the Chicago architectural scene. He was a liability, and in this city, that is a death sentence for a career. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone notified me of a message from Valerie. She had followed through on the evidence I provided. Her brother's firm had blacklisted Jensen across their entire network of subcontractors.
She told me that Jensen's mother had been forced to sell her car to cover the initial legal fees for the inevitable criminal charges. Mrs. Garrick had tried to call me again, but I had already changed my number and redirected all of her emails to a folder that was being monitored by my own legal counsel. The social protection Jensen had relied on his entire life had vanished. He was 34 years old, and for the first time he was standing in the cold without a script or a support system. The structural failure was complete. I went back to the West Loop apartment and I looked at the city from the window. The apartment felt larger and the air felt cleaner. The system had taken over the process of accountability, and I was no longer required to participate. Jensen's belongings that he had not collected were donated to a local shelter, and his name was scrubbed from every professional record I touched. He was a ghost in the machine of his own making. I did not feel a sense of relief, and I did not feel a sense of joy. I felt the satisfaction of a project that had been successfully managed to its conclusion. The boundaries did not expire. They became a permanent wall.
The final confirmation came 3 months later when the formal charges were filed for the forgeries. I was asked to provide a final statement for the prosecution, and I did so with the same precision I had used from the beginning. Jensen had moved back to his mother's house in a small town outside the city limits. His reputation in Chicago was non-existent, and his ability to work in consulting was gone forever. He had lost the status he craved and the resources he had stolen. I saw a photo of him in a local paper from his new town, and the man in the picture looked like a stranger, someone who had never known the weight of the granite countertops or the view from a West Loop high-rise. He had built his life on the assumption that he was too smart to be caught, and I had proven that he was simply too arrogant to be careful. I am Sloan, and I am 32 years old, and I have reclaimed the narrative of my own life. The apartment is my own, and the career I built is untainted by the parasite who tried to sell it. The revenge was not an emotion, it was a series of logical consequences that Jensen had set in motion the moment he decided to hide a phone behind a box of matches. I did not go too far. I simply allowed the truth to reach its natural destination. The city of Chicago is busy and indifferent, and it has already moved on from the story of a man who thought he could lie to a project manager. I have a new ritual now, one that does not involve checking for vibrations or looking for hidden shadows. I look at the blueprints of my future, and I see a structure that is solid and secure, and entirely my own.